we're going to resume our meeting. We just got back from closed session, and Council, could you report out, please?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The Board of Supervisors met in closed session to discuss agenda item number 1. On today's agenda, the Board met and conferred with its labor negotiators. Those negotiators representatives were Allison Hauk, Danya Torres-Wong, Ray Espinoza, Joe Paul Gonzalez, Melinda Casillas, and Georgia Cochran. The employee organizations that were discussed were the Institutions Association, Law Enforcement Management Employee Group, SEIU Local 521, the General Union Employees, the Deputy Sheriff's Association, SEIU United Long-Term Care Workers Local 6434, and certain unrepresented employees, namely the confidential management and appointed department heads. At this time, the Board took no reportable action.
Thank you so much. We'll continue with start regular agenda. CAO Espinosa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, we're on item number 2 this morning, and this is with regards to financing and financing our infrastructure within our county. So we have David Leifer here. I'd like to invite you up. He'll be presenting to your board and to the public possibilities, different approaches, some strategies that we might want to take a look at with regards to financing and dealing with our failing infrastructure.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is David Leifer, and we're going to get a presentation set up here. There's hard copies for members of the public as well. And if you just give me a minute, we'll jump right in.
Searching.
What's that?
It's searching.
Oh, it's searching.
Okay. Move the mouse. Move the mouse. Hit the keyboard.
Hit the, let's see. Oh, it looks like maybe this was turned off. Yeah. There we go. Getting a little power going. Okay. Well, while she sets that up, let me just start with an introduction. So as your CAO mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about financing options, public financing options, particularly for roads and transportation projects. And we're going to talk a bit about sales taxes and the range of options that the county has available to it. First, just a word about myself. I work for a firm called KNN Public Finance. We're in the Bay Area. We are what's known as a municipal advisor, otherwise known as a municipal finance advisor. I've actually been engaged with the county since 2007. I don't know if any of you were on the board in 07, but I did several presentations back then on debt capacity and on OPEB funding and other things at the time. And my role as a municipal advisor is to provide staff and board with independent, objective analysis and advice to support decision making. So identify the options, identify pros and cons, risks, and help you navigate a strategy forward using or not using public financing, bonding, things like that. So that's my role. We're going to talk today specifically about roads, but it could be in connection with other capital projects or other financing needs that a county might have. We also get involved, obviously, once there are bonds to be issued, if there are bonds to be issued, our role as the advisor is to protect your interests through that process and to ensure that the county's interest is protected throughout. We'll also talk a little bit about possible new revenue sources that could support bonding other than the general fund. So that's my role. On page 2, we've sort of talked about the overview. Just another page about the role of the municipal advisor. Many of you may be familiar with the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill that was adopted by Congress in the wake of the financial crisis. They shone a little bit of light on our little niche of the world, public finance and the financial advisor. And what they did is they assigned a fiduciary duty to the role that I and our firm has. We've always assumed that to be the case, but what that means is by law, we need to put our clients' interests ahead of our own. And I think what Congress was saying there was in the realm of public financing and bonds and bonding, we want to make sure that public agencies have somebody on their side of the table that's looking out for them through this process. And that's what the municipal advisor does. Many of you may be familiar with other players in the bonding realm. The most commonly referred to as the broker-dealer or underwriter. It might be a JP Morgan or a Citigroup or a B of A, something like that. They have an important role as well, but their role is distinct from our role. Again, we have that fiduciary duty, and that's what distinguishes us from the broker-dealer. And what the broker-dealer is doing is they have products that they come and they're selling, and hopefully they're good products, but our role is to evaluate those for you. And then when there is a sale of bonds, they come and actually use their own money and facilitate the sale of the bond to the investor, the ultimate buyer of the bond. And we're going to talk more about these concepts. Our role, again, is on your side of the table. In that process, we would make sure that you're getting the appropriate interest rate, the lowest cost of funds in that negotiation. So there's some overlap in the roles, but our role is the fiduciary, and that's separate and apart from the role of other players in the bonding process. And as I said, I've been engaged at the county on and off since 2007. Hasn't been a lot of public financing needs over the last few years, so this is the first time in a while that I've been in front of you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, welcome back.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So we're going to jump right into some of the discussion about public finance. I have just a page here on page, if I could see, I don't have my glasses, but page 4, Introduction to Public Finance. Just a statement at the outset about when a client calls me and says, gee, we'd like to finance, a road, or we want to build a new admin center or a new facility, where do we go? Well, we first go to the legal basis for issuing a bond. So the legal issues determine what tools are available to a county, to a city, to a state in doing public finance. And we usually are going to go to the state constitution, and then there's state law, and then there's local law. And that tells us specifically what counties have the authority to do. You can lease property. You can do certain types of debt. But if it's not there, you can't do it. So there are restrictions. And then there's the state constitution, which tells us, you can issue a general obligation bond if you get a vote of the people. But otherwise, there's other things that you can and can't do. So all of that affects our bonding. And then there's what the market will let you do. So we can say, yeah, you have the authority under the law to do X, Y, and Z. Then we got to go out to the market and actually sell the bond. And that's when the market tells us what we can do. And they'll look at your credit rating and your credit worthiness and decide whether to lend you money. A bond is basically a loan from the investor to you. So those are the multiple levels that we're going to need to work through as we think about bonding. So what I put down here on this next page, page 5, is a couple of the most commonly used techniques to bond for capital projects. And this first page is those that don't require voter approval. And then I've got a page of some that do require voter approval. And the one I really want to focus on is this first one. And you'll hear some reference to this later, so that's why I want to set the table. A lease financing, whether it's a lease revenue bond or a certificate of participation. That's the way that most counties finance capital projects, like administration centers, courthouses, sheriff facilities, you name it, they tend to use this. We lost our power again, I'm not sure why. But they tend to use COPs. And so what's happening in a COP is there's a piece of real property. You have a building, and you're basically leasing it. It's a lease-back transaction. And so you're making a rent payment so long as you have use and occupancy of that facility. And so that's the fundamental nature of a lease financing. It does not require voter approval because you're actually entering into a lease. You're not committing yourself to quote-unquote debt for the future. You'll make lease payments so long as you have use of that building. Obviously, the importance of that pledged asset is critical. So if you were to pledge a golf course, the investors might not think so much of that as compared to a jail, which is highly essential. Because if you fail to make your debt payments, the investor can then foreclose on that asset. So they don't really care about foreclosing on a golf course, but they know you're going to care a lot about giving up your most essential facilities. So that's a way of doing bonding that does not require voter approval and that cities and counties use frequently. And it does involve the backing of the general fund. And so I'm going to stop there. We'll move on and talk about some other ones. You don't need to become an expert in this today, but that's an important one. Some of these other things that counties use, enterprise revenue bonds, that's like if you run an enterprise like a solid waste system. you could issue bonds against the enterprise's revenues, the net revenues of that enterprise, and we do solid waste bonds for counties. And then tobacco settlement revenue asset-backed bonds, you may recall years ago, the counties received tobacco settlement revenues through this big master settlement, and some counties were able to bond against that and use those proceeds for capital projects. I think the county already, I don't know if you bonded against your tobacco or not. Not sure. You did. Joe Paul knows. Okay, so that's already happened. So let's move on to the next page, page 6, and just talk about some of the financing instruments that are commonly used that do require voter approval. The most common, as you may be aware from school district finance, are general obligation bonds. And those are voter approved. Typically 2/3 vote, though certain school districts now are allowed to do 55% vote under Prop 39. And that's an ad valorem property tax. So voters are adding to their property tax bill. So that's the security for the bond, and the bonds will be paid back by an increase in property taxes. And as a result, they have a very high credit rating. They're considered very safe, and they're very difficult for counties to pass. It's just very hard for counties to get a 2/3 vote among the electorate generally, though Santa Clara County, which is a client of ours, passed a very large GO bond, I think $800 million, for their hospital seismic retrofits, and the voters supported it. So we do see it occasionally, especially for hospitals, libraries, sometimes for public safety. Those are the most common uses for which we see counties getting a 2/3 vote. More common for school districts than for counties. Sales tax revenue bonds. This is what we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. I'm not going to get into it heavily, but again, you go out to the voters, and here the voters approve a transactions and use tax or a sales tax, and the revenues from that can be used to secure some new bonding. And those bonds can, we'll talk about what a special tax is versus a general tax. A general tax would be for general government operations. A special tax would be for a specific subset of projects like transportation, roads, and you would identify that to the voters in the ordinance, and you could only spend the money on those purposes. Mello-Roos or assessment district bonds, these are commonly issued in connection with private developer development efforts, and those are secured by special taxes that voters, property owners, impose on themselves. And then this, you might start hearing about enhanced infrastructure financing districts. Don't need to spend a lot of time on this today, but this is sort of a follow-up to the redevelopment agencies, which were effectively killed by the state, and they've created this enhanced infrastructure financing district, not nearly as flexible or powerful as what the RDAs were, but if there's interest, we can talk a little bit about that some more. Okay. So that gives you just a real quick overview. COPs for buildings, non-voter approved, and then you got the GO bonds and the sales tax bonds, voter approved. So let's move on and talk a little bit about sales taxes now, because this is the instrument we really want to talk about today for roads in particular. And I know that there's a great need for road improvements within the county, both perhaps, Highway 25, the regional project, and local roads within the county itself. So how might we go about a sales tax to help fund roads, whether we use bonds or not, frankly? So here's a couple of different ways. First, we ask the question is, who imposes the sales tax? Okay, we know the city of Hollister has a sales tax. The county could impose a sales tax. And then the COG, as the transportation authority, could also impose a countywide sales tax for transportation. So I've separated out counties versus the countywide transportation authority. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what you could do just as San Benito County. And like the city, under the Revenue and Taxation Code, you could impose an add-on sales tax. And by that I mean an add-on to the base sales tax in California, which is about 7.5%. And I think Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about that after I present. So the county can vote. The board would have to vote to put it on the ballot with a 2/3 vote of the board, and then the voters would vote on it. If it's a general tax for general operations of the county, it would require a majority vote. If you fashion it as a special tax for specific projects, say roads, and you list the roads and you develop an expenditure plan, that would require a 2/3 vote So there's a higher threshold for the special tax, but voters might be more inclined to support a tax that has specific limits to it rather than make it fully available to the board as a general tax. So you got this trade-off of what do you want to use it for, and what will the voters be more likely to support you in. Now, what some counties have done is they've gone for a general tax, and then they've said, hey, voters, we're really intending to use this just for roads. Okay, so trust us, we're going to use it on roads, but it's a general tax because it only requires 50% vote, or 50 plus 1. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll have the voters do an advisory. So they'll pass the general tax, and then they'll pass an advisory ordinance which says, we'd really like you to spend this on roads. Okay, that's an advisory measure. But legally, it would be available to the board for any operational purpose. So I believe County of San Benito had a general tax, Measure T, many years ago in 1994. I think it was on the books for 4 years. Joe Paul, I don't know if you're familiar with that and what the money was spent on, but it's for operations, correct? Right, and that's the same as the city of Hollister has had. They had it in '07 for 5 years. They got it extended for another 5 years till 2000. In 2012, it'll go till 2017. General tax for operations. So that's one approach, and you could do that for roads and use that money for roads or possibly bond against it. And I'm going to show you the numbers in a minute, but I wanted to explain the basic concept. So that's one approach. One thing that's important, and Sarah's going to do a little presentation on this, and that is that if the county or a city does an add-on tax, and I mean add-on to the state base rate, that's 7.5%, there's a restriction in the code which says there can't be more than in excess of 2% of add-on taxes. So if the city of Hollister does a 1 cent or a 1%, and you guys tried to do, say, a 1.25%, that would be 2.25% add-on, at least as it applied to the city of Hollister, and that wouldn't work, at least as it applies to the city of Hollister. Or if the city maintained their 1% tax and you did a 1% tax, and then the COG tried to do a 1% tax for regional transportation projects, that might also run afoul of this 2% limit. So you're starting to get a sense of how agencies might need to work together a little bit within a jurisdiction as they think about their own needs and going to the voters and not wanting to confuse voters too much or impose too many taxes such that the voters simply reject them all. So you got to think about that vis-a-vis the city and some of the other taxes. I believe San Juan Bautista has a 3/4 cent general tax on the books as well. Okay, so that's the county's approach. Then there's the Countywide Transportation Authority. And under a different law, the Local Transportation Authority and Improvement Act, sorry, I'm just going to try and keep this thing alive. The countywide transportation authorities can pass a sales tax with a 2/3 vote of the electorate. Okay? So that's going to be a special tax, and it's very common. And we call those self-help counties. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but Contra Costa County, Solano County, Tulare County is a client, Madera County, Santa Clara County. They all have countywide transportation authorities that have passed a sales tax that were approved, a special tax approved with 2/3 of the voters. Those can be used for state highways, local roads, public transit, like light rail, obviously probably not relevant here, but certainly in Santa Clara, VTA has one. Usually the Council of Governments, the COG or the CAG, is the lead agency in their role as the transportation authority. They would go out and seek this tax from the voters. And what they might do is build an expenditure plan which shares the money with various agencies within the county. So they might say, a client of mine is Sonoma County Transportation Authority, okay, up in Sonoma. They passed a self-help tax, 2/3 vote, and they said 40% of the revenue is going to go for a regional project. There it was Highway 101. Here it might be Highway 25, the expansion of Highway 25. So 40% in that case goes to the regional project, and then they return the remaining 60% to the cities within the county and to the unincorporated area of the county based on some negotiated basis. Could be population, could be sales tax generation, whatever. So they reach an agreement before they go to the voters, and then as part of the expenditure plan, they tell the voters, this is what we're going to do with the money. And that way, the cities are inclined to support the tax because they're getting some of the money, as is the county, for local roads, maintenance, things like that. So it's a sharing arrangement. I have one client, Napa County, that tried to go out with a sales tax like that, with the expansion of Highway 12 or something. It failed. Finally, it failed two times on a countywide transportation approach. And the third time, they went back and they said, you know what, we're just going to we're going to do this tax, and we're going to give it all to the local cities for roads. We're not going to do any regional projects. And that passed. And now they reached an agreement, and they give it to the city of Napa and St. Helena and Calistoga, whatever, and to the county based on an expenditure plan. So the countywide transportation authority, at which the county obviously has a seat, along with the cities, could impose a tax as well. And so we need to think about that. Do you want to work through that entity, or do you want to work on your own? And you could access money for roads both ways. And that's really the point I wanted to make. And we'll talk, I've got some numbers for you to start looking at how much can you generate with a sales tax under these different approaches. And I'll get there in a minute. So the last sort of general comment is just, what are the considerations as we think about a sales tax here on page 8? And I think we've covered them all. You know, who's going to impose the tax? Is it the county? Is it the city? Is it the transportation authority? Okay, so that's going to be question one, or both. You know, we could have multiple taxes. What level of voter approval are you going to seek? Is it a special tax, or is it going to be a general tax? What's the amount and the length of the tax? Obviously, you're going to get more money with a higher amount and a longer tax. But as you do that, you probably diminish your likelihood of passing that tax, certainly for a general tax. And so those are considerations. And you have to be mindful of that 2% sort of cumulative effect as well. Are you going to pass a tax with the support of other entities and have a tax sharing arrangement? Or is it simply going to be for the county? What are the capital projects that you're going to try and fund through the tax? Road construction, maintenance perhaps, other things, I don't know. And then you'll get into eventually what the ballot ordinance needs to look like. And to the extent it's permissible, you're going to want to authorize bonds within that language. That's a little down the road, but when you get there, we'll want to bring in the appropriate lawyers to look at that and make sure it's flexible. So then this last page here on 9, just a little bit about some of the prior local sales tax measures that we were able to identify within the county. And I realize now San Juan Bautista has a tax, so they should be on here as well. But the COG, Measure A, passed Measure A in 1988. So that was a 10-year, half-cent special tax, presumably a 2/3 vote back then, and for local transportation improvement projects. And I think that was the Highway 25 bypass was built with that tax money, and I don't know what else. I'm sure there were other projects. We could go online and look at the expenditure plan that the voters voted on, and you'll see it. So that was a COG-inspired tax. I don't know if there was any sharing with the county for local roads. Probably not. Okay, I'm getting a nod on no. Then the county itself passed Measure T. From what we could find back in 1994, it looked like a very short tax, 4 years, 0.5%, half cent, and it was a general tax. Could be used for operations. I don't know what the intended use was at the time. Might have been a time of a recession, and there was, you know, operational deficits, perhaps. Here, the city of Hollister has had these two taxes, one still in effect, 07 and 2012, 1 cent, that's a full cent, 5-year terms, general tax, okay, 50 plus 1%. Okay, and then I'm understanding that San Juan Bautista out there has a 75-cent, 0.75% tax in effect right now. Okay, so there is at least a good history of the voters supporting sales taxes in San Benito County, which is, I think, encouraging. Okay, so let's get into what a tax would really look like. I've got some numbers here, and how you could bond for it. So on page 11, Now I'm going to talk about the two ways to bond, okay? One way is to go with a special tax, and then to go with a bond that we would call a sales tax revenue bond. It's a bond secured just by that sales tax, no general fund behind it, okay? That's the kind of bond that the COG would probably issue, or the Transportation Authority would issue if they passed a special tax. And if you passed a special tax, you might consider that. And so no general fund behind it. Let's just leave it at that for a minute. The other approach is to go with a general tax. You go with the 50% plus one. Then you can't issue a sales tax revenue bond. But what you can issue, remember we talked about that lease financing earlier, that COP, lease revenue bond. You could do that as long as we can find a piece of real property. So if you said, hey, we want to issue $20 million of COPs, but we want to make sure that we use our sales tax to pay it. That you can do, but really the general fund is behind it if the sales tax turns out to be inadequate. So the investor is going to say, yeah, I love your sales tax, but I really love your general fund. Yeah.
Madam Chair, I'm going to ask a question right
Please.
here. So you would wait till after the sales tax is passed before structuring the bond?
Absolutely.
That's right.
In this case,
Okay.
unless you wanted the general fund to be on the hook regardless.
No,
Yeah,
no.
yeah. No, you'd want to know that that tax passed, and then what you would want to do is size the debt service of your bond to be comfortably within the range of the expected amount of the sales tax. Otherwise, your general fund's at risk. So we'll look, I've got some numbers on your historical sales tax collections, knowing that it's volatile and it goes up and down, but generally it grows with time, over time. But there'll be years where there'll be in a recession, temporary recession. But yes, you're right. You'd want to know that that tax passed before you bond, under either scenario. Yeah. So this other scenario I'm talking about is you pass this general tax, it passes, and now you're collecting X dollars a year. So now you go and you issue a certificate of participation so that the debt size, we size it carefully so that the debt service equals about the amount of sales taxes that you get every year. And that's pretty flexible. And the difference is you got the general fund behind it. So the investors aren't too worried about that sales tax dropping. But with that sales tax revenue bond, they are worried because they got nothing else. So let's just say you get $100 a year in sales taxes, just a simplified example. If you issued bonds that had $100 a year of debt service, the investor might be a little worried because if the next year sales taxes decline 10%, there isn't enough money to pay the bond. So what the investor is going to require is that you downsize that bond a bit. So if you get $100 a year in sales tax, they may say, I only want you to have bonds with $50 a year of debt service, a 2-to-1 cushion, okay, the cushion. So that's the difference between that sales tax revenue bond and that certificate of participation, because with the general fund behind it, you could bond up to that full $100 that you're going to collect, and as a result, I'll show you some numbers, you're going to get a little bit more money up front with the COP approach than with the sales tax approach, but there's some trade-offs. So the difference being the general fund behind it. I know I'm throwing a lot of concepts out here, so please jump in with questions. But when we look at the numbers, I think it'll become a little more clear. So here on this page, just a little bit about your historical sales taxes that we found at the Board of Equalization website. These are actually retail taxable sales. These are the sales data to which a sales tax might apply. And you can see back in 09 and 08, during the Great Recession, we had some big drops. These are very standard. Santa Clara County. I mean, every county suffered some level of decline in the neighborhood of 20% over 2 years. So you've got 24% decline over 2 years, county-wide. So that's the county-wide sales tax, taxable sales data. On the right is just the county unincorporated, just to give you a sense. And, the numbers reflect the similar trends, clearly. But pretty strong growth the last few years, a nice recovery, right? Pretty strong growth. And then you look at the averages, though, and over 15 years, county-wide, it's been about 3%. And that's what we assume in the long term in a model. We're going to assume 3% for sake of discussion. But just over the last 3 years, it's been much stronger, about 7% growth, making up for the declines that you had before. And so this is why we have that cushion I was talking about. If you're issuing a bond just by sales taxes, secured just by sales taxes, the investor wants to make sure there's enough money to pay them even in those decline years. Okay. And another comment that we discovered in looking at this, and that is that the county, in terms of taxable sales, county accounts for roughly 40%. So roughly 40% of the taxable sales within the county happen in the unincorporated area, if this data is accurate. So now we start saying, okay, let's run some debt capacity numbers. Let's get to the good stuff. How much money can you bond and get for roads? Well, we got to start by making some assumptions, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but what I've got on this table here on the next page, on, what is that, 13, I take that taxable sales data, and the last full year we have is 2013 from this SBOE. And so then I got to escalate it, because I'm assuming this tax that you might pass is in 2016. Say we go in the 2016 election. I assume November. You could go in June, I guess, so either of those are options. So you go in 2016, you pass the tax, let's say it gets passed in November, and then typically with a 2/3 vote tax, the tax would go into effect the following April. Okay, so now we're into 2017, and so we assume that you're going to issue some bonds starting July of 2017, the beginning of that following fiscal year. So we take your taxable sales data and we grow it. We escalated it for the next 3.5 years at just under 4%, because growth has been kind of strong recently. And then after that, we assume 3%. But, I mean, you could have us run any number of different approaches here. And then we came up with, if we applied a half cent to that, we came up with about $3.2 million a year in sales taxes. This is super rough, you know, but it's a starting point. And then we said, okay, if you issued a sales tax revenue bond, you'd want to have some cushion, right? You can't bond against all of it. So you'd have about $2.1 million of that $3.2 million available for debt service each year. And then we can size bonds that way. And, but if you issued a certificate of participation, you could have the full $3.2 million available to you for debt service. And so that'll show you the difference in these different approaches. Okay, so let's get to the good stuff. Page 14. So here's some debt capacity numbers for different approaches and different structures. And I'm going to walk you through these, and then we'll spend a little more time going back to each one. The first one says a half a cent for 20 years, okay, A. And that's a special tax, a 2/3 vote. I think that's a COG-driven tax, you know, a county-wide regional tax, though it could be done by the county itself, but I'm sort of thinking county-wide here. And we use this coverage factor of 1.5 times. And so what you get is about $30 million of bonds in 2017. But then you get more than just the bond proceeds, because remember, in my example of $100 of revenues and only $50 of debt service, so in a normal year, you're still going to collect that extra sales tax revenue above the debt service. So that's money that comes into you for pay-as-you-go projects. I call that pay-as-you-go capacity. So in any transportation program, it's a combination of bonds and pay-as-you-go dollars. And the secret or the trick is to optimize all of that. But you're going to have both to use for projects, and that's the goal. And so over 20 years, you'd collect another $46 million. Now, you couldn't spend it all on day one. It comes in over time. So you got roughly $30 million of capacity for, you know, if you bonded against the whole tax, and then you'd have over 20 years another $46 million. Now, let's just say, in scenario B, that that tax got passed, but only 40% of it, or that 40% of it came back to the county. Let's just say you cut a deal with the COG to give you your 40% roughly. Or you pass the tax and you keep 40% and you cut a deal to give away the rest of it to the cities. I mean, there's a lot of different ways this could happen. And you're still doing your special tax, and you're still doing a sales tax revenue bond, and you still want to build some coverage in. So against your 40%, you're generating just under $12 million of dollars for immediate projects. And then you're collecting from your 40%, you know, 18, 19 million over time. And that assumes there's some growth in sales taxes at 3% a year also. So obviously much less, but this would just be for a county now, not for the big regional project. And then I said, well, what if you took that 40% But instead of issuing sales tax revenue bonds, you did that lease approach, the lease financing approach for your county roads now. And you have to find an asset of a sufficient value. And you can see you can generate a little bit more. Instead of that 11 million, you're generating 17 million of bonds in scenario C, because we can bond all the way up to the expected amount of sales tax because you got the general fund behind it as well. And then over time, you're going to be collecting a little bit less, about 11.3 million. So you'd get that 17 million up front for projects right away. And you might not need it all. I mean, you may say, well, how quickly can I build roads or fix roads? I don't know. I mean, that's something we'd have to discuss. But many transportation programs issue bonds over time, like now and then 3 years from now. It depends how quickly they can spend the money. So that's using the COP. And so in this case, you'd need to find an asset, a building or combination of buildings with $17 million of value to use as collateral. So that's a question mark we'd have to have a discussion about. So those are the kind of special taxes I'm sort of modeling here. Now let's move over to columns D, E, and F. I'm assuming here it's a general tax. Just the county passes this, not the Countywide Transportation Authority. And obviously this could be in combination as well. So a 20-year half-cent, probably a stretch for a general tax. I'm not sure the voters would support that, but it's possible. And you issued COPs, you know, from day one. So that's your most upfront money, 43 million. And then you're collecting 28 million over time from the growth of sales taxes. Every year it grows 3%, but our debt service was locked in on day one, and so there's this excess amount of sales taxes coming in every year. In fact, it might be more. You might grow at 5%. Who knows? It's just an assumption. But we think it's a reasonable one. So that's that scenario. Then you say, okay, you know, let's be maybe a little more realistic. Let's go for a 10-year general tax. Okay. Well, if we really wanted to just bond against that from day one, we could generate about $25 million through a COP. Again, we'd need assets of that amount, though, to pledge. And then we'd collect about $9 million over time, over that 10 years. And then we said, well, no, let's keep narrowing it down. Let's go for a 7-year tax, general tax. And so that generates, you know, just over 18 million in COP proceeds and about 5 million over the 7 years in excess sales taxes. So you can get a sense as we shorten the tax, we can bond for less and we collect less in the pay-as-you-go projects, but still pretty considerable numbers, I think, for county road projects. Now, I got to think if you're trying to tackle both the Highway 25, which is probably a huge expense, and your county needs, a county-only tax may not get the job done. You might need to work with the Transportation Authority to get a tax for a regional project, some of which is either given back to you or all of which could stay over there. I don't know how much that project costs. I mean, if that project is more than, you know, $30 or $40 million, they're not going to be in a position necessarily to give 40% of the tax back to the county. There's not going to be enough money. And then maybe the county goes for its own tax, for its own roads, and does COPs. We can structure a bond secured just by the sales taxes, even for a county general tax. It's a little trickier, the law is a little more unclear, but we'd have to build in that coverage. So, you know, there's flexibility to do that, but I would think if you could identify the assets, the COP approach might be a better approach with the general tax. But the city of El Cerrito has had a general tax that I think they bonded a sales tax bond for. The legal authority is a little unclear. We had to kind of create a different structure, but it worked.
Supervisor
Question.
Patella?
Yeah, just hearing what
Yeah.
you're saying there, could you do it in a combination, identify an asset of lesser value and then structure it where?
Some of it is the sales tax. Yeah, of course, you could do, so you'd be doing two different bonds, basically. You'd be doing a COP for 10 million with an asset worthy of 10 million, and then the remainder as a sales tax revenue bond with that greater coverage. They're kind of two different bonds, really.
We're talking a little bit higher interest rate because the risk is higher, or
You know, that's a
how they
really
adjust things?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. On the one hand, a sales tax revenue bond with sized conservatively with adequate coverage is a really highly rated instrument. I'd say a AA, okay, for you know, maybe not, you don't have as robust an economic base as the County of Alameda, so maybe it's going to be, you know, an A+ rated or a AA-. But if you have adequate coverage, it's viewed pretty safely. Okay, you look at it has to be able to withstand those shocks of the declines.
So
But if,
you would probably be structuring the bond within 60, 70% of,
exactly,
Okay.
of the max
yeah,
capacity.
of the max.
Whereas the COP, okay, is really rated based on the county's general fund rating. Now, the sales tax that you pass, the general tax, helps. That's general, you know, X million dollars more in the general fund, but it's your overall rating. The county, I don't think, has been rated in a while as the county. You haven't issued a certificate of participation. But I would expect, you know, a high A rating, maybe a low AA rating for the county's general fund, depending on the amount of reserves that you set aside and whether you're running a structural deficit or not. I mean, these are the factors that go into a county general rating. And so it's kind of a wash. You know, a good sales tax bond is probably stronger than a COP because you don't have, in a COP, you have the risk of that asset, that real piece of property. What if there's an earthquake? Okay, what if there's a fire? The investor may not have the access to that property. Now, there's insurance and there's ways that we kind of work around it, but it's viewed, a COP is viewed as a slightly less attractive credit, certainly than a general obligation bond that has, you know, a tax behind it. So tax-supported bonds are viewed pretty favorably. So, but you got to put in that coverage, and you can't get as much as a result right away, but you get it over time. So, yeah.
You made mention, or you
please.
referenced that 0.5% for 20 years, maybe not. How did San Juan Bautista pass 3/4 cent in perpetuity? That's my understanding.
Is that true? I don't know.
I-
Did they pass it in perpetuity?
I think they did.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering.
That's
what was-
impressive.
What was the trick to that?
That's worth looking at. I don't
Yeah,
know,
I'd
Sarah,
like
what do you
to
think?
find
Yeah.
out. Well, we're going
Yeah.
to see them on Thursday, so.
Yeah,
maybe
you might ask them. I mean, what is it that they're supporting that the voters felt so strongly about? Yeah, it's important. I mean, I know that,
keeping the lights on.
yeah, right? I mean, yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, that, you know, essential city services, police, fire.
Yeah, feed the chickens,
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
when that passed,
Yeah.
but I believe that that's the case.
Yeah, I'm not an election consultant. I shouldn't judge that a 20-year half cent wouldn't pass. I didn't mean to
I think it
judge
depends
that.
on what you're going to be, well, roads
Yeah.
are forever, and so I'm thinking, okay, maybe for us, in perpetuity, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, roads certainly are important on everybody's agenda. Everywhere I go, Napa County, you know, Sonoma, everybody's talking about roads. It's one of the big deferred, you know, needs in every county. So hopefully the voters would support that. Would they support it as a general tax, though? I mean, ideally, you would say, hey, general tax, but we're going to spend it on roads. And people need to trust that that's, you know,
That's what's
and they would pass maybe an advisory measure directing you to spend it on roads. And I would think that would be, you know, a good approach. Especially if you're doing, you know, I don't know when San Juan Bautista passed their tax. Was it at the height of the recession when the lights were about to be turned off? What's that?
2004 or 5.
Okay, so that's before kind of the big, you know, '08 recession. So, yeah, it's worth, I know Sarah's done a lot of analysis on some of the other taxes around the state and what's working and what's not. So, yeah, that's worth looking at. So that certainly should be kept on the agenda. Any other questions on the numbers on this page and how this works? You know, sort of going from the special to the general. Okay, I'm almost done. So here I just wanted to show you, this is then really not a big deal, but this is a cash flow model, which a really simplified version. But this one is a sales tax revenue bond. So you see, we got your sales tax revenues, say, in row 10, 3.2 million, and we have debt service of 2 million, because we had to build that cushion in, right? And so we've got available for pay-as-you-go of 1.183 million, is starting in that year one, assuming our numbers are remotely accurate. And then the pay-go grows because the sales tax is growing. It's growing at 3% a year. So, and the debt service is staying fixed for the remainder of the bond. So,
And I want to
Yeah.
make sure I
Yeah.
understand this, is that it's the revenues that you're counting here on this chart is the 0.5%. It's not the rest of it that we're using already for other
correct.
operations.
This is all just any new tax. No, you're right. The county already gets 0.75% under the Bradley Burns for county operations, and 0.25% goes for county transportation projects. No, that's not what we're talking about here. This is only any new tax. So in this scenario, you can see how the pay-as-you-go dollars might climb quickly. If the sales taxes grow at more than 3% a year, you'll get more in your pocket as you go. And therefore, the debt coverage grows also, because as sales taxes grow each year, the investor is that much more protected for a future downturn in sales taxes. But the investor will not let you assume growth. From their point of view, they look at the last year of actual collections and then build your cushion on. They're not going to let you say, oh, don't worry, we're going to have growth 5 years from now, you'll be fine. That's not going to fly. So this is that scenario where we generate $30 million up front, whether through the Transportation Authority or through the county directly, either way. And then this next scenario is a certificate of participation financing against a 20-year tax, just illustrative. So here you got the same sales tax revenues, $3.296 million, but now the debt service is sized almost all the way up because we got the general fund behind it. So there isn't much cushion on day one, but then there's growth with time. So your pay-as-you-go is less here because we didn't size in any cushion. Our debt service is higher than it was on the last slide. I'll go back if you want. Yeah, on the last slide, debt service was only $2.1 million a year. This time, it's $3.1 million. So we're getting more money up front, less pay-go. And then with growth, we'll have a little bit of pay-go as the sales tax grows over time. So I just wanted to use this model as a simplified version to show you how that pay-as-you-go works, that there's some growth there. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop, to be honest with you. I mean, the next few pages have bonding assumptions on how, what interest rates we used and different things. And, the market is going to be different 3 years from now than it is today. If interest rates go up, you're going to be able to bond a little bit less. The more money from your sales tax goes to pay interest than it goes to pay principal, just like in a house mortgage. If interest rates go down, you'll be able to bond a little more. I mean, there'll be a lot of moving parts. And if you get serious about this, we can run some sensitivity analysis, and we'll run it under different market scenarios and sort of bookend what it would look like. I also have in the appendix, way in the back, page 22, a little bit more of the historical sales tax data, including the city's data, if you really want to kind of dig in and look at some of these taxable sales. The other thing I'll point out, and Sarah will talk about this too, is that when you pass a transactions and use tax, there may be some transactions to which it does not apply. It's, a T&U tax it might be a limited basket of sales. So I've just gone ahead and taken your retail sales and assumed that the half cent would apply to everything. It might be a little more limited to that. There might be certain types of transactions that aren't subject to a new add-on tax. I don't really know yet. But so these are, sort of rough numbers in that respect. But I think it gives us a starting point to look at what you could generate, and then you guys can talk about, well, what are your road needs? Right. And I think the big questions for you are going to be to what extent you pass a tax at the same time that maybe the city is looking to extend their tax, and whether there's going to be voter fatigue there, whether you guys think it makes sense to work together or not, and or work through the Transportation Authority, and you have a seat at that table, and maybe they go for a regional tax for Highway 25. Do you want some of that kicked back to the county for local roads or not? Those are a lot of interesting pieces. But I'm going to stop now and see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, are there any questions from the board?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Supervisor Patella?
Yeah.
I was just looking for my budget, and I don't know if you're the right person to
Okay.
ask, but off the top of my head, I don't think we get $3 million worth of revenue.
Excellent point. You don't. The reason is, and we went through this when I had a meeting with staff, is that you're getting revenue just from the unincorporated taxable transactions. When I'm assuming a countywide sales tax, it is drawing tax from the entire county, including the cities.
So there would be a portion of that revenue that will be going towards the cities, and the cities will be expecting it.
Well, not necessarily. That's up to you. So let's talk about that, and then I don't want
So
to
Sarah's
Can I do
actually,
this, or you
Madam
wanna
Chair,
talk about this?
Sarah's
I'm
actually
going
going
to let Sarah talk about this. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Sarah is going to define for the board and the public, basically answering your question, so, yeah.
All right.
Okay,
That's a good question.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Very excellent information.
Okay, good.
And Chair Barrios, it is Measure K. It was November 3rd, 2004 for San Juan Bautista, and I'll talk with elections to see if I can get the specific language. I couldn't find it online,
What
but I'm
was
sure
the date
Angela has
again?
it. November 3rd, 2004
2004.
is when San Juan Bautista had Measure K, and that was their 0.75%. They went back again in 2008, apparently, to increase it to 1.25 for some sort of emergency services, but I don't know if that was approved, just quickly looking, so.
Okay.
I'll try to have that by the intergovernmental meeting. So I have been researching and reading tons. Board of Equalization, HDL companies, we have a gentleman there named Don and also Andy. They provide analysis, revenue projections, and in general information and advice to cities, counties, and special districts. So they've been able to kind of confirm some of my worries, so hopefully I can speak to you all with confidence today. But that's what I'm going to be basically sharing is what I've learned in those conversations and readings. So first, I wanted to go over understanding terms. So it's actually from the Guide to Local Government Finance. There are 3 terms that are informally referred to as sales taxes. So sales tax, use tax, and then the transaction and use tax, which David has been referring to also as the add-on. That is the piece that is important to us and what we're looking at for the upcoming election. He also mentioned the statewide rate for local sales and use taxes, which is 7.5% currently. 6.5% of it going to the state, county transportation getting 0.25%, and the city and county, this is also referred to as the Bradley Burns portion, 0.75%, which is based on where the sale occurs. So it is important where you're buying for city or county. The current add-ons that we have would be the City of Hollister transaction use, which was mentioned. It does actually, it started 4/108. Then the City of San Juan Bautista's 0.75, which is forever, effective 4/15, which brings us up to our current rate. City of Hollister, 8.5, ends March 31st, 2018. City of San Juan Bautista at 8.25, and then ours, which is the base rate. Now, when you're looking at this blue section here, that is what we would refer to as our local sales and use tax rate, because it includes all our add-ons, just to be clear. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about rules. So let's not look at all the numbers quite yet. This is Revenue and Tax Code 7251.1, which, as David was mentioning, our 2% cap. And this is what HDL helped me understand, as well as Angela from Elections. So thank you, Angela. Talked it out with her. And what this does is it basically means that what we do countywide does affect our cities. And what our cities do can preclude us from increasing our own rate because of the 2%. So forgive the childish image I'm going to show you is actually inspired by Supervisor De La Cruz, thank you, for shoes. So, countywide. As we said before, it does matter where we're buying. That 0.75% that's in our base, that the city or county gets back based on where you're buying your pair of shoes. So Supervisor De La Cruz gets a great deal on some Jimmy Choos in the city. City's sales tax of that 0.75% would go back to that city. So let's look at what our current rates are again, right there. Let's say now that we do a countywide increase of 1%. That would, in effect, change all of us. We would be 8.5, San Juan Bautista, 9.25, City of Hollister, 9.5. Let's assume that their 1% add-on at City of Hollister is forever. If we raised ours 1% countywide, that would mean they could not go again to raise their tax because they're already at the 2% limit. Now, let's say they get their tax forever that they have now, and they go 1% as well, do another one. So now they have 2 add-ons that go straight to the city, and they're at 9.5%. that means that countywide, we can no longer do a countywide tax that includes the city of Hollister. So we're going to come back to that. Now we're looking at scenario 2, unincorporated only, which is brought to us by AB 2119, which has been put into RTC because it shows there when I Googled it, so it must be true if it's on Google, but really it's on the LegInfo site. So ignore this number for now. I was doing this late. So this would mean that just unincorporated area, we're raising our tax. And as our tax stands right now, it's at 7.5. By ourselves, we could raise it up to 2 if we're looking at the unincorporated area only. So we could be 9.5% in the unincorporated area. Not that we would ever ask for 2% on a ballot, but just for understanding this rule. Why does this part matter and why is it a race? It's because this is the piece that the Board of Equalization distributes based on what's called the initiating district. If we initiate our 1%, that means that that 1% is being collected by BOE and distributed back to the county. If the city does it, it's for the city. And then that's where tax share agreements come into place, because why would the voters of the city want something that's in the county only unless they get some sort of benefit from it, right? So, Supervisor Munzer?
Started losing you.
Okay.
If we were passing a unincorporated county tax only, why would the voters in the city be voting?
They wouldn't.
Oh, okay.
Unincorporated only would vote.
Okay, okay.
Right. If it was countywide, then countywide in the city and outside. Yes.
But it is interesting, myself living in the county, my operation is in the county, buying, when you buy something, the tax is sometimes assessed to the city tax, and we have to call that vendor and tell them, heck, we want to save 1%, we're located in the county, and we don't want to pay the city tax. And that's, you know, I've done that more than once.
I have
on-
too.
On
It
big,
works.
big expenses.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, these dynamics and how confusing it is. But that's part of the rules.
Right. And it gets worse, too, when we start talking retail versus, you know, where it's coming from, where it's going. Then we have online sales, and I don't know about that yet, so I can't speak to it. But I wanted to give you that visual so we can understand that rule. I don't know if I want to go back to the language, so maybe I will. We'll start here. So just keep that part in mind. So I guess the point of that is, again, that countywide does affect all, and depending on who does what first, it could potentially prevent us from doing something as well. So we do need a, you know, collaborative approach.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question?
Oh, you may come up to the
No,
podium,
I just
please.
want to ask a sort of question. So if the county passed a general tax,
Can you come to the podium? That's the way we do.
okay,
that's
sorry,
our
David
norm.
Leifer from
Thank
KNN.
you.
So if the county passed a general tax countywide,
Yep.
all of the money would come to the county, even under that tax, even sales that occurred in the city?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So, what I've also been looking at is a language comparison of passed and failed ballots, and I just looked at 2014. And the language I've been noticing, as you can see on the left, very popular is citizen committee oversight in actual ballot language. I know there's been a lot of talk about trust. So in the ballot, they'll actually say it will also be subject to the development of, something like this, that looks at spending and making sure it's being spent however it might be. For example, David mentioned an advisory question. In Monterey, City of King actually did exactly that. This might be kind of hard to see, but basically they had a general tax, and they had two questions, two measures basically. One, the advisory question of, if this does pass, the half cent, whatever it is, shall the city spend it on this in this way, 50% here, so they did public safety 50%, 30% to money management, debt reduction and reserve, and 10%, two sets of 10% to communication and appearance. So that was one popular option. That one actually passed with flying colors. Other things that I've just been noticing in analyzing the 2014 stuff is that a lot of them are temporary that are passing, and typically 5 to 7 years at 0.5%. Mostly general. And lots of funding can't be taken away by the state to be used here locally. So just making that very, very clear. Started to see some failing things with generals at 10 years and definitely after, and a lot of them being permanent minimal language, not talking about where it was, where they intended it to be spent. A lot of them focused on public safety, fire, 911 communications, and sometimes even elderly one of them actually mentioned sidewalks for seniors and caring for the sidewalks to better serve the public. So I had some hanging questions at about 8:30 this morning, but I had them answered by HDL, so that was what that was at the side there, so we can just ignore that for now. But David and I are pretty much summarizing similar questions. Are we going general or special? Temporary, permanent? If so, how long? Do we have an advisory question? County-wide or unincorporated? Are we going to do some tax share agreements? Are we going to focus on just the unincorporated area? And how much? And I had a recommendation here to be changed, and again, hopefully going to have the same information presented on April 2nd to the intergovernmental. But of course, general, temporary, 5 to 7 years seemed comfortable, and definitely including the advisory question and as well the review committee for building that sort of trust. I totally agree personally with permanent, but I think that showing what we do for a period of time would be wise. So unincorporated countywide to be determined, up in the air. Seems easier at first glance to do unincorporated areas, so that's what I have for you today. Any
Thank you.
questions?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I just want to make sure that we invite COG to the meeting on Thursday. I don't know if they plan to be there.
I will definitely Mary is here today, and
Mary, you are here. Thank you.
I actually had this here because it actually reminded me of What About Bob, that movie from the 90s. It's What About COG?
Yeah, what about COG?
So if we had that 1%, for example, countywide, that would actually bump COG out. Not that we'd do a 1%, but the wise thing to do would be a half and a half, and we couldn't go over that 1%. So if we decided to do two separate, measures. Lots of options, but we just have to remain cautious of that. And then it's not that it's impossible. Legislation, tons of cities, Los Angeles has done it. I know that's a long haul to try to do, but it can be over 2%. It just takes further action.
Okay,
So,
all right.
Madam
Yes.
Chair, so by inviting COG to the table, does that mean that if we decide to do a 2% or 1%, COG's going to get a certain percentage? Is that the direction we're going?
That is the direction that we will have to talk about, and that is precisely why we're having this meeting on intergovernmental. We need to know how Hollister feels about this, how much on board they are, and what they're expecting, San Juan Bautista as well, and COG. So we don't know the answer to that at this time.
Well, I mean, see, here's my concern. My concern is that, and I said this at the last intergovernment committee meeting, is that we want to make sure we do it right and we don't miss out on time, because sometimes
Exactly.
time is very important. That could only be our best friend on educating the public. So unless COG gives us an answer right now or takes their position to the Thursday's meeting, we're going to have to wait for COG's response, see what they're going to do. Unless COG already met last time and they already have a position that they're going to share with the intergovernment committee, then yes, that's great. I'm looking at both COG members. Has COG a position on the direction?
Well,
Chair?
I think the question, right now, that Supervisor Munzer mentioned earlier today, that we're doing a survey where we'll find out what the sentiments and reception of a special tax would be, especially emphasizing transportation, road maintenance, maybe a portion of it going towards the funding of Highway 25, and go from there. And this is where intergovernmental, this board needs to make a decision,
Right.
and the city of Hollister needs to make a decision whether it's to be a general tax. If it's to be a general tax, I think that plays out COG, because COG would only have to be, my understanding, it would have to be a special tax emphasizing on transportation. They wouldn't administer a general tax. If it's a general tax, I think it has to go to the counties, and then if we split out a portion of the revenues, would be to our own public works for road maintenance on specific areas of need in the unincorporated areas, as well as the city would get a portion for their roads.
Right.
And a portion would be dedicated maybe back to COG for Highway 25 improvements for, a future date. That's the way I'm just guessing from
Yeah,
my perspective. I don't know.
And I
the
believe that
Supervisor
you're
Munzer.
right. That really lends itself to a lot of discussion and deciding on how we're going to support each other in this effort.
Because, Madam Chair, because as I recall, the prior discussions we had at the Intergovernment Committee, it was not specifically, 100% for transportation. It was more of a general type of tax, and then when the idea of COG is pushing on it too, so I said, oh, well, then there might be a mission statement type of, they're in conflict with each other, and there might actually be a timing issue too.
Yeah, and I agree. But don't forget that at Intergovernmental, one of the plans is to reach out to the community to see what they would support.
Yeah,
And see if that would
yes.
include, are we talking roads? What is the priority for the community? And there's parks, and there's library, and so all that conversation should be at a public setting. So,
May I ask Mary to come up to the podium?
you may?
Because if the intergovernment is talking about doing a survey, I'm wondering where they're coming up with the money to fund that. Mary, what is COG spending on our survey?
It's about $13,000 for a voter survey of about 300 voters in San Benito County, registered
No,
voters.
the intergovernmental is not a survey. It would be more like town hall meetings.
Oh,
where-
okay,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
right.
I misunderstood.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's
But-
exactly
but
how
if-
the response, exactly.
But if I can continue, I'm not sure what's on the agenda for the intergovernment for
Sales
Thursday.
tax only, that's a conversation.
What?
Sales tax,
Well, okay.
or tax period.
But I
would-
think it would be wise to let COG complete its survey, come up with the responses, and get a feeling of what, the voters feel about a sales tax measure. And then, I just, with some of the comments of Supervisor De La Cruz, it sounded like the intergovernment was planning on making some kind of decision.
No, we're only
Thursday.
going to be getting together to present information
Okay.
pertaining to county, city, and the cities as to how it would affect them, what percentages, what kind of money, what would it mean
Okay.
in the way of revenue. So it's really more general.
Yeah, my,
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
concerns, my questioning in terms of concerns or moving forward is that, to me, and it's just one supervisor, if there's any sales tax, I'd like to see it in the November 2016 election. And it's going to require a lot of public education, a lot of outreach into the community. So I, as a supervisor, have expressed my thoughts to my fellow intergovernment committee members that we can't delay this 1 month after another month. You've got to reach out to the proper organizations like the Board of Supervisors, City Council, COG, San Juan Bautista, and anyone else who's involved. Put our minds together and try to come up with some ways how to work together. And if that's not possible, then everybody goes their own way, and COG you're doing your own way. You're already doing a study. You already spent $14,000. Intergovernment has no intention of spending any money without getting Board of Supervisors, City Council's approval. That's the reason why I might sound the urgent need, because as you know, 1 month can take 6 months before people can say, oh, yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a reason why we're having this presentation today, because this is the groundwork for how we're going to proceed. So, yeah, this is very important, and I agree with you, Supervisor De La Cruz, that we need to do that today. And so that's why we're here. So, okay.
And not only that, Madam Chair, this is very important, is that the city also has some deadlines that they have to consider too.
Yeah, and they are aware of that, and they will be discussing that at the meeting on Thursday. Okay, Supervisor,
Madam Chair, since I had Mary come up, would she like to comment, make any comments on it?
absolutely.
May I
Mary.
comment? Sure. I'll just let you know a little bit on the COG side in terms of our schedule and where we're at. We are doing the survey, the polling right now. I'll be getting some really preliminary results on Friday. And we're working to have that information to present to our COG board at our April meeting on April 16th. So we're definitely moving it forward. At our board retreat last week, on the 19th of March, we had a discussion about the survey questions, and we are including a little bit of language in there about more general taxes, as Supervisor Botello had requested. So, we'll be sharing that information with you as well in terms of what voters would support. And what we would be looking at, if we feel like the polling comes back and it's looking good and the COG board says, yes, we want to move forward, we'd start working on an expenditure plan for transportation projects. And again, with, as we discussed, the possibility for some funding going to a regional project, and then also local streets and roads, and then any other items that we can include. But loud and clear is the message that we know that a lot of the funding we would want to go back to the local street and road needs that are in the county. So we'd be working on developing an expenditure plan, hopefully having something in December of this year with the intention of going forward with either the June primary or the November 16 ballot. So.
Mary, how soon can we get it as a board? Because I would like to have that be part of an agenda item so that it'll be part of the planning process. So if you could put it on the April 7th, you'll have information.
I'll have some really preliminary information, and then from the polling results. And I'll be here on April 7th to present on another item. So
Okay, so could we incorporate that in?
I can, whatever I can provide, I will
make
do.
sure to put that on.
Okay, very good, thank you. Thank you, Mary. Any other questions of Mary? Supervisor Botello?
Yeah, I'm happy that Mary mentioned the question I wanted in the survey to just kind of get, as best we can, it's a COG survey, and it has emphasized transportation, but I just want to get a feel for that general tax idea too, and see the reception for that. And, and Supervisor De La Cruz is right. We got to educate the public what we want, where we're trying to generate revenue for. Every time I go out anywhere, I mention that roads is absolutely, at a crisis in this county. And there's no way we're going to have enough money to address it. And this is the only opportunity right now to, do a little bit of a catch-up on some major streets. And we're having a lot of growth, a lot of development, and it's not going to fix those roads. It's only to make them worse. And, if we don't address it now, it's going to cost, our successors a lot more money, and our residents a lot more money in the future, so.
Yeah, I agree with you. Any other questions of Mary? All right, I'll open it up to the public. Well, Sarah, are you done with
two more
your-
things to say.
Two more things, and then I'll
One-
open it up to the public for comments.
Sounds good. Our auditor had mentioned that Measure A was actually,
I just wanted to bring up that with regard to Measure A, which was passed in 93 and the tax was effective 94, no, 88, I'm sorry, passed in 1988. There were a list of Measure A projects, which was the first on top of that was the, Highway 25. And then there were, regional projects, which were, of course, in the county, county roads, main arteries. And then you had city projects that were part of the regional plan. But there was really not enough money to complete all the Measure A projects, so there was no money left over to do any sort of repair for, city and county roads. So, you might want to keep that in mind as it relates to how you structure this sales tax measure.
Thank you.
And it is, of course, most appropriate to use the COG for any sort of, road, road funding mechanism.
Right. Thank you for that, Joe Paul.
and then just my final note was Board of Equalization staff has been super helpful in there to make sure we're walking through all the steps correctly, lots of things to jump through, so County Council and I can hopefully feel better with their assistance, so just want to let you know.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for all that information. I'll open it up to the public. Same old public, but we like the public.
Morning, Richard from Hollister, and first I'd like to thank Mr. Is it Leifer or Leifer? Leifer, thank you, Mr. Leifer and Sarah both for really an excellent presentation, really, really good. I hope the public is watching so they get some understanding of what's going on. And as many of you probably know, I supported Measure E, the 1% sales tax at the city. But I have been up here several times talking about leveling the playing field. Are we all in this together in this county? Supervisor Vitello, who's I don't agree with him most of the time, but he's an honest person. He always says what he means. And he says, I bought a big ticket item, and I call people up and say, I don't want to pay that 1% because I'm not in the city. 40% of the sales in this county are coming from the unincorporated area, and they're not paying that tax. It's not fair. Somebody buys the same car, you've heard me say this 100 times, the same car from the same place in Santa Clara, and the people who live in Hollister are paying another 1%. The richest people in this county, that's Aromas, that's Ridgemark, that's the big farms, and the people buying big ticket items are paying nothing. That's nonsense. That's not fair, and you're not even talking about leveling the playing field. Now, I know what the excuse is going to be. Oh, this is just about roads. This is nothing else. Listen, we all know that every tax measure affects every other tax measure. Now, you've got to do something about leveling the playing field if you want people in this city, in the city of Hollister, to pay more taxes, because they're paying more taxes right now than everybody else. And you don't only have a road problem. As you well know, you have a public safety problem. I've heard you say it. We have a library problem. We have this problem. We have that problem. We don't have money for this. We don't have money for an ambulance service. We don't have money for a lot of stuff. It's about time you guys took the action you need to take and stop playing favorites against the city with the people in the county who have the most money and paying the least taxes. That is simply not fair. Okay, they need to pay their fair share, whether they live up in the north part or in Aromas or in Ridgemark. They need to pay their fair share of the local taxes to support the county. And that's what I think you should do. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Anybody else from the public? You don't have any other speaker cards? Okay, if you could come up, please.
Good morning. I just want to give you maybe a quick and dirty on Measure A. Measure A was passed to get the 156 traffic out of downtown Hollister. That was the original project. There were, I believe, 6 other projects added, and those projects were added because to bring the 2 cities along, we had to have projects involving both cities, so everybody would be on the same page and pass the initiative. So I think it's very smart the way you're moving forward, where you're getting everybody involved in deciding on the best projects.
Thank you. Okay, we're getting near lunchtime, so Supervisor De La Cruz.
Yeah, if, Madam Chair, if you do allow us to go to lunch, I'd like to think this at lunch.
I'm going to allow you to go to lunch.
I know COG is moving forward on it, and I appreciate it, and we definitely want some funding for the roads. And Supervisor Vitello, is this a 0.5% or a 1% that it looks like it's going to happen?
I don't even know. It might be a survey question.
It's just a survey question. But let's assume it goes that way, and it's going to dictate to, say, 1%. Let's assume. And Sarah keeps bouncing the idea that the maximum is 2%. Now, the city of Hollister, they have their 1% too. So if COG is moving forward and it becomes a countywide, so that becomes the 1% now. And so then the city will most likely do it on their own to do their own 1%. But they might actually object to the COG saying, wait a minute, if we can't get our 1% passed and we're dropping down, we're losing the 1% in 2018, and now we have we're going back to 8.5, for example, and a good portion of it's going to go to COG, then why should the city volunteer and go along with COG's tax initiative for transportation?
Well, first to clarify the issue, I think the respective boards have to support whatever COG you would come back as a recommendation. I don't think Supervisor Munzer and I are support a sales tax through COG without the blessing of the full board and the full report and our position and how much money we're going to be able to work with and understand the splits, if that's the direction we're going in. I kind of have a feeling that ultimately it's be a city and county joint effort, and, and you're right, can the city, we're talking about 0.5% or 1%, and I think we still have to determine that.
We do have to determine, but those are good questions, Supervisor De La Cruz, and
That's
really,
something-
that's the reason why we are going to have these joint meetings, so that we can discuss it thoroughly and end up with a direction that's going to benefit all of us, so.
Okay,
Okay, now, the next item on the agenda, are there any other questions from the board?
good discussion.
The next item on the agenda, it's going to take us more than 10 minutes for presentation and discussion, so I think we'll break early for lunch, come back at 1:30 if the rest of you are okay with that, and then we'll probably be here another hour or two after lunch, so. Okay, so thank you, everybody. We'll come back at 1:30.
I'll just turn this off for now on. Just turn it off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Do you want it in color or black and white? Doesn't matter.